Getting back to the Nestle example with what went on in Brazil, where he talks about how they basically said, well, we were trying to help the poor. That's the kind of virtue signaling that causes a lot of our problems. And when large companies like Nestle and so many companies are doing a lot of this virtue signaling and doing things that look on the surface like they're doing something good, the people that work in those companies are able to use that as their excuse as to why I'm doing this. Really, it's because they want to get paid, but they have to justify things, and they're using self-deception to accept that these practices are okay because it supposedly helps the poor, or at the very least, it makes me look like I'm trying to help the poor. Just like these politicians who like to be able to talk about how they're helping the poor, but everything they actually do hurts the poor. Hi everyone, it's Dante Ferrigno at Ferrigno Freedom Channel here again. Thank you for joining me today. I know if you clicked on this video, you might have been realizing you're in for a long one. I don't doubt that this is going to be a long video because I'm going to be covering an entire book that I read in the past 36 hours. Really, I finished reading it yesterday afternoon, but some things came up in my family where I had to participate with them last night, so I didn't get to make this video last night like I had planned. But I'm glad to be able to have slept on it because I'll tell you, some of the stuff that I dealt with in this book really, it gets under my skin, and I had to process it properly. Heck, I even had nightmares about it. It was so frustrating because, well, let me just start talking about the book first and we'll get into it. The other day on Facebook, I shared this information about this book. I talked about how I'm only through the intro and I'm already hooked. Compelling excerpt from the introduction of the book Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tulleken. It's worth your time, and it is worth your time. I made a few typos in this that I haven't fixed yet, so please forgive me. Everything about eating is complex. Our senses of taste and smell, our immune system, our manual dexterity, our tooth and jaw anatomy, our eyesight. It's hard to think of any aspect of human biology, philosophy, I think that should be physiology, or culture that isn't primarily shaped by our historic need for energy. Our bodies have superbly adapted to using a wide range of food, but over the past 150 years, food has become not food. We've started eating substances that are constructed from other molecules and using processes never previously encountered in our evolutionary history. Substances that can't be really called food. Our calories increasingly come from modified starches, from invert sugars, hydrolyzed protein isolates, and seed oils that have been refined, bleached, deodorized, hydrogenated, and interesterified. These calories have been assembled into concoctions using other molecules that our senses have never been exposed to either. Synthetic emulsifiers, low-calorie sweeteners, stabilizing gums, humectants, flavor compounds, dyes, color stabilizers, carbonating agents, firming agents, and bulking and anti-bulking agents. Now that was a quote from the book. This was my first few minutes reading the book from the intro. And he stated so much just in that opening statement right there that points to exactly what's wrong with most of us right now. Why most of us feel sick and fat and tired and achy. And all of the problems that we're having is all of this garbage that I just talked about is in at least 60% on average of the food we eat on a regular basis. Just realizing that that's what's going on ought to tell you that you've got to stop just reading the front of the package. But there's so much more in this book. I had to take some notes so that I could come back and talk to you guys. Otherwise, I would never cover all the bases I want to cover. And I'm sure once I edit this video down, it's going to be a lot smaller. So hopefully this video wasn't too long for you. If you don't have 11 and a half hours to read through the book like I did, which is not very long as far as audiobooks go. Heck, I'm working on The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire right now, which is well over 100 hours long. This way, at least you can get the gist of what you can get from this book. But I've included this link to the book in the description, and I've also included it on the Facebook page. So if you're interested in downloading this book or buying the hard copy of this book, you can do so, and I get a small percentage because it's an Amazon Associates thing, and it does help the channel. I think the author has great intentions, and I think that his study on ultra-processed food is excellent, and it's definitely worth knowing. I don't necessarily agree with his approach to things. He has some left-leaning thinking that I picked up on, and he also seems to be more about plant-based foods. but he doesn't force anything on anybody. And that I can appreciate about him. He is somebody that I could listen to from a different perspective, talking about the same thing we talk about here in the carnivore community. That is an area where we can come together. And I think that we need to be looking for areas that we can come together on and agree when we have differing opinions about things, and working together toward those goals is going to make life a lot better for a lot of us. All right, one last thing I shared here. Now, this first sentence is me speaking. The Cambridge University Press offers a great definition worth reading if you care about your health or your children's health, of what roughly 60% of our diets consist of on average in 2023. Ultra-processed foods are defined within the NOVA classification system, which groups foods according to their extent and purpose of industrial processing. Processing enabled the manufacture of ultra-processed foods, including the fractioning of whole foods into substances, chemical modifications, and these substances, assembly of unmodified and modified food substances, frequent use of cosmetic additives, and sophisticated packaging. Processes and ingredients used to manufacture ultra-processed foods are designed to be highly profitable, low-cost ingredients, long shelf life, emphatic branding, convenient, ready to consume, hyper-palatable products liable to displace all other NOVA food groups, notably unprocessed or minimally processed foods. The author even points out how interesting it is that they would put the reason for ultra-processed foods in the definition for ultra-processed foods, and realizing that it's about basically profit motive, because when it comes to what we put in our bodies, you would hope that that wasn't the primary driving goal. It reminds me of that movie about McDonald's called The Founder, where they decided to stop making their milkshakes from natural ingredients, and they found a powdery substance that they could put in water that would make it taste and feel to your mouth just like a regular milkshake. And then they could market that for a lot less money, and they could produce more of it. Sounds great from a company perspective that's trying to make a profit. But when the unsuspecting public is taking these things in, and our mouths are sending signals to our bodies that tell us, oh, that's what this is. This is that natural stuff. But once it gets in our bodies is saying, what do we do with this stuff? We don't even know what this is. And it starts causing all kind of problems. I found it interesting that the author was studying molecular biology when he was working toward his PhD, when he stumbled across the fact that food would become the future of his life, but his research in molecular virology would become invaluable for his future research in food. At the time of the study, they realized that scientists were saying that 50% of the DNA in every human cell is composed of ancient dead virus genes. And they discovered eventually that these dead viruses aren't actually dead, but rather have functioning genes ready to make more viruses. And it turns out they're suppressed by other genes in the cell, like a cellular arms race. We're literally at war within our cellular structure. You know, you often hear it said that we are 96% like the chimpanzees when it comes to our protein makeup and things like that. But these old supposedly dead viruses are what make humans so genetically different from chimpanzees. So I found that very interesting. That's even from a spiritual perspective and how humans are created different from the animals. I think it's very interesting, especially when you consider the notion of original sin and how it infects the flesh and these old dead viruses and what they do. Now, when it comes to figuring out how we're going to change what we eat, one of the things that I found interesting that he pointed out, and I think is true, is he said what we eat is determined by the food around us, its price, and how it's marketed. And this is what needs to change. I've been feeling this in my experience on Lion Diet for the longest time, that the hard thing is what's right around us all the time. When I'm out to eat with other people, when I'm home eating with my family or seeing the stuff that they want to eat, that makes it very difficult. Price is a huge driver for almost everybody, because food is a good portion of what we have to spend money on, especially with the inflationary system that we live in right now. Food is way more expensive than it should be, but it's even more expensive because it's been cheapened so much. The lower you are on the income scale, the bigger a factor it becomes. Lastly is how it's marketed. Chapter 1 is called, Why is there bacterial slime in my ice cream? when you read through the chapter, you realize he's talking about xanthan gum, which is a slime exudate produced by bacteria to allow them to stick to surfaces. That sounds good, but that's exactly what they use in the strawberry ice cream. He goes on to talk about stabilizers, emulsifiers, gums, lecithin, glucose, and seed oils as being the hallmarks of ultra-processed food. And I'm going to use the phrase UPF when we say ultra-processed food. Now, UPF isn't just about additives, but that's a huge part of it. Because as he mentions in the book, it's very difficult for food manufacturers to get around the cost of transportation, refrigeration, getting the food to market. But the one thing their accountants can play, as the author says, whack-a-mole with is the ingredients. By cheapening the cost of the ingredients and also making the ingredients a part of the process of keeping the food ready to eat is a big part of what goes into making this food so bad for us. Also, repurposing waste is a huge part of ultra-processed food. The author mentions an acronym here in chapter 1 called RBD, refined, bleached, and deodorized. How seed oils are made and how they get out the things that cause, for example, infertility in men, like cottonseed oil can do. The ugly color and the rank smells. They do it by refining it with heat. Gums and waxes are removed with phosphoric acid. They're neutralized with caustic soda, bleached with bentonite clay, and deodorized with high-pressure steam. All of these things have an effect on the food, much of which oxidizes, especially when it comes to seed oils. And that oxidated seed oil is what causes inflammation in your body. The author doesn't go into a whole lot of that here, but my experience with seed oils is what leads me to say that, which is why I would say that you want to avoid these things at all costs. Chapter 2 is called I'd Rather Have 5 Bowls of Cocoa Pops, the discovery of UPF. Dividing foods into categories of processed and unprocessed is an impossible task. Try to think of a single food that is truly unprocessed that you can eat whole and raw and was never selectively bred. A few wild berries, oysters, raw milk, some mushrooms, and not much else. Hacking a chunk of meat off of a mammoth carcass is processing. Cooking with fire, also processing. Ultimately, what he's getting at is we knew junk food was bad for us, but we didn't associate it necessarily with processed food because we realized that there is some process that goes into just about all food. Chapter 3 is called Sure, UPF Sounds Bad, but is it really a problem? I can understand why people would think this because it's become so ubiquitous with us to have ultra-processed food in our diets that we don't even question it anymore. He talks about how marketing, advertising, packaging, false health claims, etc. are all ubiquitous parts of UPF. The study done in this chapter revealed that it was clear people were still overeating UPF even when the foods that were not UPF. See, UPF is like level 4 on the 4-step scale of foods where it's not processed at all, or it has mild processing, or it's considered a processed food, and then you had ultra processed. So even when the foods that were not ultra processed tasted better and were more palatable, people still ate more of the UPF. That was interesting because we thought maybe that it was the taste of UPF that was driving it, but it wasn't just the taste. There was something more to it. The big thing that they reveal in chapter 3 is that it has to do that it's less expensive and it's easier to prepare. It's right out of the package a lot of times. You can stick it in the toaster, hit the button down, wait a minute, and then come out. And if you're in a real hurry, you can stick it in the microwave for just a few seconds. And that's what made it appealing for the big part. Chapter 4, I can't believe it's not coal butter, the ultimate UPF. Coal butter is butter made from a waste product from turning coal into petroleum. This was used in our foods so that we could come up with a way to eliminate those waste products by selling them to us as food that they're not. It's kind of the same concept behind seed oils when it started with cottonseed oil, the very first UPF, where they took this slime that was left over after they processed cottonseed, this junk that looked and smelled terrible, but they realized that if they could bleach out the color and get the stink out with all the things we mentioned before, they could market it as something like lard because it looked and had the texture of lard. So that's exactly what they did. They repackaged their industrial waste and sold it to us as food. Part 2 says, but I can't control what I eat. And then chapter 5, which is the first chapter in part 2, he goes into the 3 ages of eating. Now this gets into a lot of history of man type of stuff where he talks about things that I'm not so sure we know our history as well as we think we do. We have all of these people that are saying that things happen for millions of years or billions of years in some cases. And a lot of this technology that we use for dating has been proven to be inaccurate, and they're using a lot of conjecture in these discussions. So I didn't really get too hot on chapter 5. But then I did get into chapter 6 about how our bodies really manage calories, because I have been an advocate that calories are not a big factor for us, ultimately because we can't really manage the amount of calories we eat. We're going to either follow what our hunger tells us to do, or we're going to get in a fight with our hypothalamus. I did find it interesting, though, that the author pointed out that eating for pleasure and for fuel are intimately linked. And we can see that. Most of the things we do for entertainment these days involve going somewhere to consume things with people. It has less to do with what we used to do, like going out dancing or even watching a movie. We go out to eat. And even when we go to watch a movie, we eat garbage. The thing about ultra-processed food, though, is that it's hyper-palatable, and it tricks this system between pleasure and fuel in our brain into thinking that we are getting that fuel, but we're only getting the pleasure and we're not getting the fuel. And then this note that I made for myself: UPF disrupts our energy intake system and affects our ability to self-regulate. This is one of the reasons I think I call myself an addictive personality. I've been addicted to UPF all my life, and now my response to sugar is the same as for someone who is addicted to a powerful dopamine-boosting drug and then reacts to the reintroduction of those drugs after they've tried to quit them. That's one of the reasons why when I tried fruits and when I tried dairy again, I ran into some problems where I couldn't regulate my intake because I was reintroducing the sugar that I was so addicted to. But not just the sugar, but all the things that are in ultra-processed food that trick my brain into thinking I'm getting what I need from this stuff. Fruits have been processed because of their crossbreeding issues and genetic modifications and a number of other things that are done when it comes to chemicals that are used to either keep the pests away or to allow the food to ripen while it's on its way to you. Now, chapter 7 I thought was interesting because he said why it isn't about sugar. They admit that avoiding saturated fat and salt didn't work back in the 80s and 90s, which we've all come to agree on this channel. He does not support low-carb diets, and the reason why is he concludes it's hard to regulate a low-carb diet. I will say that I agree with this in a sense, because it's one of the reasons why I wasn't able to stick with it when I did the Atkins diet. I was mixing in some of the things that Dr. Atkins said were okay, but a lot of those things, like mayonnaise, turned out to be ultra-processed foods at this point because they've been dumbed down and they've had like all the fat that used to be in mayonnaise is not there anymore. You're using soy and lecithin and things that are just ingredients that are made to make this food cheaper and less fuel and more about pleasure. My brain was still searching for that pleasure hit that came from those foods, and slowly all of these things started to creep back into my life. But as I've been doing it more carnivore based, the more I get away from anything that's pure carnivore, the easier it is to fall back into those things. And that's why I encourage people, don't see ice cream and other things that you used to consider treats as treats, because they're not. The hard part is that so much of these things are full of things that are not actually food. Like when you buy ice cream from the store, if it was cream, sugar, and salt, then you'd know you were getting natural ingredients. But even the best ice creams have some stuff in it, usually some kind of artificial flavor. I don't want that in my food, and I don't want that in my body. I like in this chapter he talked about good science is about trying to prove yourself wrong. And that's one of the things that I try to do sometimes when I'm on a carnivore way of eating. I'll try to prove myself wrong. I've done videos where I talk about coffee, for example, and I talk about how the neurotoxins and the things that are in the plant material can be a problem, especially if you've had leaky gut like I've had. And then like this past month, I've been trying coffee on a regular basis just to see, and I have noticed immediately that I have a harder time waking up in the morning. I have more aches and pains. I find myself craving coffee more. And it's proven to me that the scientific research that others have done, like Dr. Huberman, is very revealing to me that it is actually affecting my body. Because so many people will tell you that coffee is great. I love my coffee. I need my coffee. You're listening to an addict, in my opinion, when you hear those things. And unfortunately, I often feel like coffee just leaves me feeling more tired and more achy in the long run. So since I've been trying it for this month, I'm cutting it back out because I wanted to be able to prove to myself that it wasn't just something that I was avoiding because I had put a stigma on the notion of caffeine, or I was just doing it because it was plant-based. I wanted to be able to see what were the effects if I were to incorporate this in a way that was similar to the way I used to. Now, I didn't add sugar. I knew that was already bad. I didn't add cream. I was just doing black coffee. I was trying to prove myself wrong, and it ultimately proved that my hypothesis about coffee is I need to stay away from it. And I think a lot of us would do better if we did. And that's one of the reasons why, as a carnivore in the carnivore community out here, I think we all have to be careful to not just say things because it's in our tribal interest as carnivores that we're supposedly versus the vegans or anything like that, because that attitude's not going to get us anywhere. We have to be able to look at what the facts are when it comes to getting these things out. Ultra-processed food, I think, is the main problem. I find it's better just to avoid vegetables altogether because the toxins that are in there affect me so badly. But I think for a lot of people who haven't had their gut affected like I have yet, maybe young people especially, if they're eating plants that have been raised naturally, maybe under your own care or under a local farmer that you trust, you might be able to cook these things and not have the problems that we have these days. But most of the stuff you're going to get at the supermarket is just going to be more poison for you. He ultimately concludes something that I don't necessarily agree with, that the only problem with sugar is how it affects your teeth. Now, I will say that since I don't eat sugar, my teeth are fantastic. I hardly ever have to brush my teeth, and the only reason I really do is if I drink coffee or something that stains my teeth that I have to worry about because I don't get plaque buildup. I can lick my teeth and they feel clean. I've felt what it feels like when you eat sugar all the time and you get that grimy, gritty feeling on your teeth. I don't get that eating on a carnivore way of eating. But he says that it's not about how sugar affects your insulin because he's conflating the fact that people who eat a high meat diet still create a lot of glucose with their liver, and that glucose is just as bad as the glucose that we eat. And I don't think that's true at all. I think the fact that we're eating 4,900% more sugar than we did 120 years ago absolutely plays a role in our overall problem with health and weight. Not to mention all the things that we're finding out about how sugar and cancer work together when we started looking at another book that I talked about called Ravenous. And I've talked about this book with you already on a previous video. By the way, those of you who are interested in what I'm reading, you can also follow me on Goodreads at Dante Ferrigno. You can find me on Goodreads. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested in following what I'm reading. For those of you who love to read, who love this channel, I'd love to be able to talk about what you're reading too. And when you follow me on Goodreads, we can share information with each other. The last thing he concludes, by the way, about this chapter about sugar, though, that I don't agree with, he wants to force labeling to be put on the packages that warn us about the dangers of sugar. This isn't going to work any better than putting labels on cigarettes has helped. You know, a lot of people think that those labels help keep people from smoking cigarettes, but it doesn't. People that smoke cigarettes look at it and see the cancer, they'll see a picture of something, and they'll just keep smoking them because their bodies are addicted to them, because they're an easy, quick delivery of dopamine to their brain. It makes them feel a little better. It's relatively inexpensive, although it's become more expensive by government intrusion into the cost of manufacture by taxing the heck out of these things and making it more expensive for the cigarette manufacturers to make them. It sounds like a good thing, but the problem is that the large percentage of people who smoke are the lowest income people out there because they're looking for an inexpensive solution that's going to make them feel a little better about their situation for a little while. I see this as an unnecessary tax on the poor. What has stomped out smoking more than anything has been, unfortunately, the fact that we have invaded everybody's freedoms and said that you can't smoke here, you can't smoke there, you can't smoke in restaurants, you can't smoke in bars. I don't like the idea of limiting freedom to get these things done, because even though we don't have smoke in restaurants and we don't have smoke in bars anymore, and we don't have to deal with people secondhand smoke anymore, all of that sounds great, but we still have just as much cancer as we had before all this was going on. And now we've got a bad situation for the poorest people who are still addicted to the things that they feel like they need in their lives. Now, I would certainly encourage that they would want to quit smoking cigarettes, but it's not going to happen by force. It's simply hurting them more. Chapter 8, he says it's not about exercise. And he goes into the calories in, calories out model here. But he does point out that it really doesn't matter whether you exercise or you're sedentary. Your body ultimately uses about the same amount of calories regardless. So if you're expending the same amount of calories in the end, all of this calorie tracking doesn't make any sense. And I agree with that too. Now, I'm not going to say that exercise isn't a good thing because it makes you stronger. But at the same time, you can look at somebody like me and Jordan Peterson and see that I have a much different build than he does. It's not about whether or not he's lifting weights or exercising so much as it's our genetic makeup. Can you put on some more muscle? I'm certain he could if he spent more time exercising with heavier weights, but he's not as interested in that. And to be honest, even when I don't exercise, I'm relatively bulky as far as the way my body is built. But I still want to be as strong as I possibly can. And because I've seen what it's like when people don't take care of their bodies and they don't strengthen themselves, as they get older, they get weaker, and it makes it harder for them to do things. It makes it easier to have falls and accidents. And then you got to count on other people to help you. And if you're too heavy, that makes a big issue. But exercise, I think, has been overpushed as the way to lose weight, but it's still an important part of keeping our bodies strong, making our joints stronger, and keeping us physically healthy. I do find it interesting that he points out that the sugar industry invests a lot of money in putting the focus on inactivity as being the problem, so that you can't blame them for your obesity and your lack of health, but you can blame your sedentary condition. One of the things that I learned when I started doing Lion Diet is that even though I wanted to exercise before, I didn't have the energy to exercise before. It was the ultra-processed foods and the garbage that I was eating that was making me feel awful. When I started eating meat only, I had the energy. And it turns out meat is actually the only true superfood compared to all those vegetables out there. There's far more ingredients in meat than there are in the superfood greens that are out there. And once I started eating those things, I had the energy to want to exercise. As a matter of fact, I had so much energy that if I didn't use it somehow, I felt like this. If you've ever tried to have your own power, either through a running stream where you have something that's getting constant motion from the stream and you're collecting that energy, if you don't use that energy, it'll cause your generator to explode. So you have to leave your lights on and things like that. You have to use that power. Same thing when you're collecting solar energy. If you don't have a battery to back it up into, that energy has to go somewhere. That's why when you do solar energy on a house, they want you to put it back into the power grid. If you don't have enough energy to use it and you don't have enough place to store it, that energy has to go somewhere. Well, it's the same concept. When I started having the amount of fuel I needed from my food to do the exercise I wanted to do, I had to use it. If I didn't use it, I would have felt like somebody who drank too much coffee. I just have all this energy that I can't get out. Even though I don't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions here, I do agree with some of the things he said about exercise because it can be used as a scapegoat by these UPF producing companies to say that you're at fault. And this is something I have said before, that it wasn't your fault. If you were trusting these companies that said this food is healthy, this food is good for your heart, this has wheat, and it has things that are good for you. And then also when you're growing up as a little child and you look at the picture on the box and there's a cartoon monkey telling you that everything is fine here, that this is something that you want. And then when you eat it, it's sending signals to your pleasure signal that say, this is exactly what we've been needing. And it's giving me the fuel I need. And it makes you want to eat more and more of it, even when it doesn't start to taste good anymore. Like when you're eating a bowl of cereal and it starts to get soft and mushy, you still finish it because your brain is just being tricked. UPF does this to you, and it's what's causing the problem. So even though I do a lot of exercise on my channel, exercise is not what got me here. What got me here was getting rid of the UPF and eating food that was good for my body, that my body needed. And in my case, meat does everything I need. So that's why I'm a carnivore. I used to listen to all the nutritional studies and follow all the advice of the experts about what we should be eating. One of the things he points out in chapter 8 is that a lot of these studies are done by the food industry. That's a pretty severe conflict of interest. And that's why it's not your fault. Because you've been lied to, your brain has been tricked, you've been treated like an experimental lab rat, and your body doesn't know what to do with the garbage that you're putting in it because it thinks that you're actually eating food. And that leads into chapter 9, where he talks about it's not about willpower either. A lot of people realize when they try this, like they'll tell me that they envy my willpower. It's not about willpower. Genetics probably play one of the largest roles in general to what our bodies look like when we eat certain foods. But the problem we're in here, especially when you're in a lower income situation, there is a lot more ultra-processed food made available. Then he talks about how total immersion in marketing plays a pivotal role in keeping us hooked on these things. You see commercials all the time, and they never seem to stop. And unfortunately, it's even part of watching this channel unless you have YouTube Premium. So, and sometimes you're going to see the commercials that I put in. You know, and that's one of the things about me doing this channel that I have a hard time with. There's not a whole lot of companies that really want to share anything on my channel because there's so little products that I'm willing to talk about. I have shared with you some of the companies that I've used myself because I found them to be useful tools, whether it was the Dreo Chef Maker or Redmond Real Salt. Those are parts of my way of life now that make eating this way easier. So I'm able to use them to help me. So when you buy those products from them, when you buy salt from Redmond and you use my discount code, those are the things that help me to be able to have the money to do what I do here, to spend 11 and a half hours pouring through this book so that I can get this information together to share with you here on this channel. Because I know not everybody has the time and they would like to have the Cribs notes. Well, here you can get Dante's notes on it. But if we're going to be totally immersed in this marketing, the problem is that we get marketed a lot of things that are not good for us and that we don't actually want. But when you're stuck eating UPFs, your brain sees those things like the McRib is on sale and you run right down to McDonald's and buy that McRib sandwich covered in all that gunk. And then you realize that it's not even pork meat. It's like pork meat paste or something like that. It's in that soft bread that has been designed to make our mouths just crave it because it's so easy to chew. And you can't help it because that advertising jumps in and sends you out to do it. Ever since I've been doing Lion Diet, when I see those ads now, all I see is garbage because I've been able to get my brain off of those things. I've been able to unhook myself from their catchiness. But when you're eating them on a regular basis, those ads play a huge role in sucking you back in. And I agree with them on that. Another thing that we run into, especially in this world where we're constantly dealing with government trying to intrude more and more in our lives and we don't understand what's going on, is that it causes stress. And then the financial pressures that come from their bad fiscal policy that lead us to have inflation, which is that hidden tax on the poor, that raises our cortisol level. Those cortisol levels being raised cause you to crave ultra-processed food because of that pleasure kick you get from it. You desire it just like you do cigarettes and other drugs. The more we're under stress and the more cortisol we have, the harder it is to resist those things. They did some studies when it comes to food that involved twins that have been raised in different households, for instance, that have been adopted, and maybe one twin went to one house and another twin went to another house. And in studies where those same twins were in lower income homes, very often the twin who was in the lower income home had a higher BMI and more fat on their body and more health-related issues that came from eating ultra-processed food because UPFs are available to the poor in much higher quantities and there's very few real food substitutes available. Take, for example, the town that I used to live in. The little local store there wasn't going to carry any healthy food, any real food, because most of that food was more expensive than the ultra-processed garbage that was on the shelf right next to it. And that lower income community Most of those people are just going to buy the thing that's going to give them the most bang for their buck, the most quantity of something to eat for their money, the most pleasure hit that they can get from something cheap as opposed to something healthy. And then that company, that the owner of that store, is going to wind up throwing that good food away because nobody ever bought it and it went bad on the shelf. It's sad that that's a situation, but what saddens me even more is a lot of the government policies that get us into these situations. They're touted as ways to help the poor, but they actually wind up making the poor suffer the most. I found it interesting that he pointed out genetics can definitely play a huge role. For example, somebody with the right genetic makeup can eat ultra-processed food in large amounts and not gain weight, just like some people can smoke cigarettes for 80 years and never get cancer. Losing weight is still noted as a key factor for overall health and ability to weather illness, whether it's caused by viruses or external factors. So ultimately, getting the weight off is very important. And his ultimate conclusion in this chapter is the biggest indicator of whether willpower was possible to resist eating badly was more determined by the socioeconomic background of the participants than anything else. And with more and more people winding up on the lower income scale, as the inflationary policies push us into that area, the more and more these type of foods become a part of our lives. And I think the thing that kills me the most is that we're paying more for our food now than we ever did before, and the food is less food than it ever has been before. It's kind of like when you buy furniture. We didn't used to have things that when you sat on a table, the table broke in half, because we didn't used to have things that were made from compressed cardboard. We had things that were made from wood, that were built to last, and people could afford to buy one, but they would take care of it and would last for years. Now, tables cost just as much, and then when you look at it, you find out it's all compressed cardboard and that it doesn't last for but a few years. Then you realize you're spending the same amount of money as before, in some cases more, and you're getting far less for it. We have to start making decisions when it comes to how we vote and who we put into office and what plans we support. One of the things that drives me crazy is when I see smart people listening to politicians telling us that this is the way that you're going to get something for nothing. There is no something for nothing. Everybody who's offering you something, who's in a position of political power, they're taking it from you to give it back to you. But you don't get as much back when you get it that way either. And they get more power and more control. Chapter 10 talks about how UPF hacks our brains. One of the ways UPF companies hack our brains into thinking that UPF is not bad for us is they conflate processed foods with ultra-processed foods. As we talked about before, simply hacking off a piece of meat from an animal and then cooking it on a fire, that's food processing. Getting something processed in that manner is not the same as what they're doing when they change the chemical substances, when they replace one substance with a cheaper substance that tricks our brains into thinking that it is what it isn't. This chapter also goes into how the rapid delivery of a reward to our brain is the substance that makes this food so addicting. Just like any other addiction. When you take a hit of something that is a powerful drug that affects your dopamine system very quickly, that's what makes it addictive to us. What keeps you hooked on it is that as you come down off of that, you go lower than you were before, and you need more and more of that stuff. Ultra-processed food works exactly the same way. The reward pathways in our brains are strengthened the more we eat these things. That's why it's so hard to get out of eating McDonald's or eating some of the stuff that's readily available, because one, it's easy and it's quick and we're in a hurry to get everything done. It hits all the buttons that we want in our brain, and our bodies think that they've got what they've needed to power it, but we're not. The author goes into an interview here where he talks about the reason why low-carb diets don't work, because eating meat without things like pasta and starches makes it unpalatable. And I can kind of agree with this, because when I did the Atkins diet, I was doing low carb. I wasn't doing no carb. I was doing low carb. I was still eating things that had carbohydrates, just very low amounts of it. The problem with that is I was still eating ultra-processed food. Ultra-processed food causes you to crave more of that ultra-processed food. And as time went on, I was still bringing those things back into my diet. But as I've done a carnivore diet, I've been able to find that one, meat alone is extremely satiating. And as long as I stay away from those ultra-processed foods altogether, I don't crave them. Once I start adding them back, that's when I crave them. That's where the problem comes in. The other problem is the environment we live in. When the economic and political situation we live in is pushing us in a direction where we have to find cheaper solutions, it helps to have a community like what we have here in the carnivore community for support. I get so many people that join onto the Facebook group Ferrigno Freedom because we're exchanging ideas with each other. We're encouraging each other with our victories, and we're showing ways that we've been able to make something maybe that helps us to get past a craving, or how we made our food today that reminds us that we can stick with this way of eating. So for right now, the carnivore community plays a big role there, but we do have to take a stand against these people who wish to limit our freedom. As I saw in a video Dr. Baker posted yesterday, where he was talking about how they're trying to put vaccines right into the corn, right into the soy itself, right into the materials that we eat so that they can pass those things along to animals, for instance. But that's going to be in our food too. We have to push back against those who would choose to put these things in our food because they want to control us, or to make the food less palatable to us, or to make you not want to eat meat because they think eating meat is bad. Their seemingly altruistic reasons for wanting to do these things are actually a subterfuge for them just obtaining more power and more control. Oh, and more money. Then part 3, he deals with chapter 11, where he talks about how UPF is pre-chewed. The title of part 3 is actually, "So This Is Why I'm Anxious and My Belly Aches." The softness of the food he goes into here, which we've talked about a few times on this channel, where I talk about how even my wife starting to do a carnivore way of eating. And when I started, I remember thinking, gosh, I'm chewing all the time. This is rough. It's because my mouth was used to eating this pre-chewed garbage that UPF is. It's designed to be dry and soft and easy for us to eat. We can add a liquid to it and it makes it even softer, so we're hardly getting to use our muscles. This is one of the reasons why we can't fit all of our teeth in our mouths. Chapter 12, he calls it UPF smells funny. Flavoring equals ultra-processed food. When you see flavoring, whether it's natural flavoring or artificial flavoring on a package, if you see the word flavoring, it's ultra-processed. I found it very interesting, a comparison that they did where they took some of these great wine testing people, these people who are supposed to be wine experts, and they would give them a red wine and they gave them a white wine. And then whenever they tasted the red wine, they could taste all of the things that their brains had been told that this is what you're supposed to taste when you taste red wines, these robust and chocolatey and tannins and such and such. And then when they would drink the white wine, it would have a fruity flavor or something else that wasn't quite the same as red wine. But then when they took some white wine and they added some red dye to it and did the same test with the same people, they would say the same things about the red wine that was actually white wine. The bottom line is, it's very easy for our brains to be hacked into thinking we taste what we think we taste, even though that's not what we're tasting. The thing about UPF is that they make it smell a certain way because it's designed to act on our brains the same way that certain things are supposed to smell. The chapter goes into detail on how we actually as humans have a much better sense of smell than we've been told. A lot of times we're told that human sense of smell is so much worse than, say, a dog's sense of smell that we can barely tell anything. But the truth is we can actually tell the difference between trillions of different smells. We just can't always articulate the difference. But our brain knows the difference. When we smell a piece of meat, if it's rotten, we know it's rotten. We know our brain, our body reacts in such a way that tells us, I'm not going to eat that. But they make this food smell in such a way that it tricks our brains, that even though it's not food, our brains believe it is food. They've hacked our brains with the way the food smells. Chapter 13 talks about how UPF tastes odd. And this has to do with how UPF uses flavoring once again. For instance, they talk about an argument that was made that dealt with Pringles, where there was a legal case that was dealing with whether or not Pringles are actually a vegetable because they don't use real potatoes in them, that they use flavoring. And the reason being is that vegetable stock doesn't have a very strong flavor. So they have to add the flavors to make it taste like something that's even more delicious than it actually is. He also talks about in this chapter about how low sugar or no sugar sodas cause people to actually crave more sugar, causing people to actually gain more weight because they're having the craving, because their body can't tell the difference between fake sugar and real sugar when your brain is trying to determine what it is that you're eating. But you're not actually getting the sugar. You're getting the insulin released into your body. Now, he doesn't go into the chapter. This is something that I believe. The insulin is being released into your body to deal with sugar. There's no sugar there. So now your body is craving sugar because it needs something for that insulin to work on. Chapter 14 is titled Addictive Anxiety. Now, this is an area that touches on what a lot of people have told me they've been able to beat since they've gotten on a carnivore way of eating, is that they've reduced their anxiety tremendously. The biggest reason that he talks about in the book for this is that UPFs have a horrible effect on the microbiome in our gut. And a lot of people also know there are as many or more neurons in the gut as there are in your brain. That's why they call the gut the second brain. So when you're affecting that microbiome in a negative way, the author argues that that's why we have all this anxiety. We're being pulled by forces that are much bigger than us. We're not machines that just process nutrients. We are communities within our bodies where we have all these microbiotics that are working and deciding whether they want to eat or live. And when you get a bunch of bad microbiotics that are working in your body, that's what causes those anxiety problems, because they start demanding that you get things that hit your pleasure center. They start demanding that you keep eating sugar or lactose or a lot of other things that our bodies don't need in our gut to operate that cause us to have these problems. In the interview that follows in chapter 14, he talks about a lot of the things that I just mentioned. One of the things I like that he says is that he's not about banning anything. That makes me happy because I don't think we need to be banning anything. But he does think more government regulation is the solution. Personally, I think that government regulation is creating the problem because it's working together with business that is allowing government to be bought off by these large interests. And then we wind up getting everything from Ansel Keys all the way up to now, where we're just getting more and more garbage in our system. What ultimately needs to happen is to stop trying to regulate from the front end, stop trying to control from the top down, and make these deceptive practices something that should be considered the same as if somebody came to your house and said that they were a plumber, and then they did some work on your plumbing and ruined everything, that they defrauded you by deception. They told you that it was something that it wasn't. They took your money in exchange for what they were offering you, but what they were offering you was a lie. Well, when these companies advertise healthy claims on their products, it should be treated as the same crime. And criminal justice should be easier to obtain when it comes to a person who found out that they're unhealthy and sick. They should be able to sue these companies directly. And the government, if they're going to do anything, should stand in the way the same way they would if a policeman was called to deal with a criminal in this case. The state should be able to prosecute these people for individuals who don't have the money to hire fancy lawyers and don't want to participate in a class action lawsuit so that they get a check for $1.50 after the lawyers all get their money, and then everybody gets paid their small portion. And then on top of that, the company that got sued in these class action lawsuits made far more money than the lawsuit ever extracted from them. It's all just a big shell game right now. So if we get away from a lot of this regulation and actually prosecute some of this criminal behavior, whether it's on the part of these companies or it's the part of these politicians that lie to us, we might actually get out of some of this mess. Part 4 is called, But I Already Paid for This. Chapter 15, which is the first chapter in part 4, talks about dysregulatory bodies, and he goes into how the FDA has a lot of problems because of the way they do generally regarded as safe, or the acronym GRAS, which allows these companies just to rubber stamp everything that comes through. That gets back to what I was talking about before. It's not the companies, it's not the greed in the companies that's the problem. It's not capitalism itself that's the problem. It's when government thinks that it can control these things, when ultimately all it does when it tries to manipulate and control these things is allow us to have a government-approved seal on the things that are actually bad for us. Because these companies that have all this money know now all they got to do to get their competition out of the way is to be able to get the government to approve their patent, to approve their recipe, to be able to approve whatever it is that they've put together for you so that they can market it and say that the FDA approved it. And then everybody says, oh, good, the FDA approved it. It must be good for me. But the people at the FDA get all their funding from these companies. That conflict of interest can't go on. And he points that out in this chapter, which I find to be very comforting that he realizes that. I hope that the author gets it together, the fact that government can't be the answer for the problem that government is causing. He talks about how UPF destroys traditional diets, and he goes into a story that he tells about how Nestle went down to Brazil and went into lower income communities and started basically selling these UPF products door to door. And they were very inexpensive and got these people who used to eat traditional foods hooked on this ultra-processed garbage. And then as that ultra-processed garbage became ubiquitous within their communities, they started having all their health problems. Nestle packaged this as a way to help the poor. But how did they help the poor? By using predatory advertising practices and sales practices? This is the problem I have with it. When you have a good product, you should be able to market it. You should be able to talk about it. But when you're offering lies, when you're not offering value for the value that you want in exchange, the companies want money for these products, but they're not actually giving the products they're claiming to give. That's where the problem is. That's why it needs to be criminally prosecuted, because they're lying, they're deceiving, they're not using the truth. And this is what we need to demand from our government officials, not more regulation. In the interview that follows in chapter 17, he's speaking with somebody where he talks about there's no agreement among these top officials that UPF is even a problem or that it's addictive or what they could actually do about it either. But he does point out that when people have a choice, they choose differently. And usually that choice is affected by how much money they have to spend on the problem. The problem I have with even going to these top officials to ask them to solve the problem is that they're not interested in solving these problems. They're interested in having constituency that's hooked on whatever they're giving them, just like these companies are interested in having people buying their products because they're hooked on whatever they're giving them. These same practices happen at the tops of government as they do at the tops of companies. And when government, which is supposed to be protecting the people, is on the take from the companies that are supposed to be feeding the people, that's where we get this circle of problems, because we think that these people are actually watching out for us. And they don't care about us. They care about more power, more control, and more money, whether it's in government or in business. Government shouldn't play the role that they play when it comes to regulating these companies, but they should be dealing with the criminal behavior that is involved in these companies. We're not treating criminal behavior as if it's criminal. We're actually voting for it and treating them like celebrities. We watch them on the news and we watch them on their debates and we listen to our favorite guy and we cheer for him and we say that that's the guy and everybody else we boo for. Almost all of them are involved in this criminal activity and we just let it go because we want our guy to win. We fall into our little tribal communities and we forget that it's about whether or not you're doing the right thing, not just saying the things that you want to hear. He acknowledges some of the benefits of animal fats, which I found was interesting. He talks about how palm, corn, and soy are being used to replace natural fat because it's cheap and bulky, and that's all ultra-processed there. Finally, part 5, what the hell am I supposed to do then? The author's conclusions. He gets into chapter 18 where he says UPF is designed to be overconsumed. He has 9 points that outlines how UPF affects the body. UPF is soft and easily consumed and bad for our bodies. That's 1. High in calories per capita over real food. It displaces healthy food, especially for low-income demographics. It creates a mismatch between taste and feel in our mouth signals, and our gut responds to the problem differently than the signals that were sent to our brain about the food that was there. It's addictive is number 5. Number 6 basically is that it causes leaky gut. Number 7 is convenience, price, and ubiquity from advertising increases consumption. Number 8 is that this junk is bad for our bodies and minds. And number 9 is that the production of UPF requires subsidy and is bad for the environment too. And he also acknowledges that acknowledging all these things doesn't do much of anything to fix the problem. And one example he cites is a lot of these microbiome companies out there that want to sell you their prebiotics and probiotics are using the same emulsifiers and stuff that's in the ultra-processed food to make those prebiotics and probiotics. This has been something I've been suspecting for a long time, and it's one of the reasons why I tried to work with a company about some of this stuff, but when they sent me those little cans of powder, I just couldn't bring myself to put them in my drinks because I can't believe that what's in there is actually healthy for me. And it turns out I was right. The same thing that caused the problem is being marketed as the solution. He gets into what the solution should be, and that's that the rules of the road should be set by the governments. His approach to that is not necessarily the correct approach because he's still thinking from the top-down control argument. I still think that it should be dealt with as far as a criminal behavior goes. If a company lies to you and tells you this food is healthy and it's actually not healthy, they should be subject to criminal prosecution for that. And then they should have to pay recompense for the people whose health is hurt for those things. If that was being done, these companies wouldn't be doing this. They wouldn't be finding ways to poison the people because they know they can get away with it, because institutions like the FDA rubber stamp their product and give them a seal of approval that allows them not to be prosecuted because it was approved by our government. It was approved by the very people who were supposed to be watching the gates. But if there is an easy way to show they said this was healthy, it's actually not healthy, it's causing me to be sick, and it's caused all these problems, then that would allow people to be able to do some actual financial damage to these companies. Look, I don't want to see any good company go out of business, just like I don't want to see any good people put in jail for things they didn't do. But if companies are actually preying on people and lying to them and hurting their health and taking their money, they should be treated the same way a criminal who broke into your house and stole your food or stole your belongings or hurt you should be treated, because that's exactly what's happening to you ultimately. Getting back to the Nestle example with what went on in Brazil, where he talks about how they basically said, well, we were trying to help the poor. That's the kind of virtue signaling that causes a lot of our problems. And when large companies like Nestle and so many companies are doing a lot of this virtue signaling and doing things that look on the surface like they're doing something good, the people that work in those companies are able to use that as their excuse as to why I'm doing this. Really, it's because they want to get paid, but they have to justify things, and they're using self-deception to accept that these practices are okay because it supposedly helps the poor, or at the very least, it makes me look like I'm trying to help the poor. Just like these politicians who like to be able to talk about how they're helping the poor, but everything they actually do hurts the poor, just like these companies are doing. What we need more people at the bottom making good choices for themselves, but also good choices when it comes to what they're willing to do, what they're willing to say to make a buck, whether or not they're willing to cheat somebody out of their money. Offer value for value when you do your daily life, when you're doing things to make a living. Don't look for the cheat way out. Don't look for the easy way out. Don't fall into self-deception. All of us are going to do that from time to time, but when it is at the rate that it's at now, we just have a whole nation and a world full of people that are lying to themselves about things that they're doing to make the world a better place. But actually, if they would start focusing on the things that they need to do at home, the individual decisions that we make one moment at a time about what we put in our bodies, what we put in our minds, and how we affect and help those around us are where we can make the biggest difference. How we can choose. Say, for instance, you're in a sales role and you see other salespeople succeeding by lying and telling things to their customers that are not true. You find that, wow, if I just did that, I could make more money. That's going to lead us to the place that we're in now, the place that we all hate so much, where there's so much lies and deception and why everybody's so angry. We've got to get back to some principles that would lead us to have the type of government that we had in this country's founding when America was founded, because there was far more virtuous behavior in the people itself. It wasn't the virtue of the people in government that made us strong, because they started getting corrupt very early on as well. But it was the virtue in the people that kept that corruption at bay. As we have lost our integrity, as we have lost our ability to make good choices, or just stop deciding to make good choices for ourselves, for how we treat our bodies, how we treat our family, how we treat ourselves, how we treat our customers. When we don't take those things seriously, we create the situation where those at the top are corrupt and criminal and controlling us from the bottom. We have to start at the bottom, and we have to make those individual decisions that are going to be good for us. And voting with your dollars is a big part of this when it comes to the UPF. If you spend money on UPF, then you're going to be basically voting for those lies and that deception to continue. So you've got to choose, where am I going to spend my money on the food that I'm going to spend? When you're voting for these companies by giving them your money, you're actually supporting the problem that you realize is causing you so much difficulty in your health. You've got to be able to make those decisions individually for yourself and for your family to get away from those things. And it's going to be hard, because all of us are so many. I venture not to say so many. I mean, I almost want to say all of us are addicts. We're all addicted to this UPF and this garbage that's in our food that actually causes us to be addicted to a lot of other things. Everything from smoking cigarettes to taking other drugs to using the drugs the pharmaceutical companies give us. All of these things are affecting us in such a negative way. We've got to be able to break free from these things. And when you're living with other addicts, one of the only ways you're going to be able to do that is through example, because you're not going to be able to tell an addict anything. An addict has to realize that he has to make a change for himself, or he's not going to be able to fix the problem. So leading by example is going to be real important. Finally, he ends up chapter 19 talking about with what he thinks we could ask government to do. I've already covered that in depth here, so I'm not going to rehash that. And then he says what you want to do if you want to stop eating UPF. Ultimately, it doesn't seem like he has a real suggestion for you, because he's not going to tell you what to eat. He says he's not going to tell you what to eat, which I can appreciate that. I'm not going to tell you what to eat either. I tell you about carnivore diet because it's what's worked for me and what it's worked for so many other people. And I suggest to people that you might want to give it a look, simply because I know you've been told all your life that it's not the way to go, that eating meat is bad for you. Well, clearly, eating meat has not been bad for me. It has changed everything. It has made my life so much better, physically, mentally, and spiritually, that I can't help but sing about its praises from the rooftops. I know there's a lot of vegans out there who claim that their diet does the same for them. And I'm certain that a big part of that is getting away from ultra-processed foods for those vegans who actually do that. There's also a push for veganism and in the carnivore community to get more ultra-processed foods in there, because companies want to be able to market this stuff to us one way or another. And if they can get vegans to get on board with some ultra-processed garbage, and if they can get carnivores to get on board with some ultra-processed garbage, then they're going to be able to get their hooks right back into you. We got to resist these things. We got to stick to the things we know that are healthy for us. If you find veganism works for you, or you find being a vegetarian works for you, that's great. I guarantee you, if you're using ultra-processed food, though, it's going to wind up ending badly. And that's where the ultimate problem is. Eating real food is going to be more expensive. That means you might have to make some sacrifices in other areas in your life. I know I have. I've had to sacrifice a lot of things that I used to consider invaluable to me for my overall pleasure. Things like what I used to smoke, what I used to vape, what I used to drink. All of those things, though, were not actually helping me with anything other than putting band-aids on problems that could be healed by eating the right way. Now that I've gotten those things out of my life, affording an all-meat diet is not that difficult. It is difficult, don't get me wrong. I am not rich by any means. I do have some things that other people don't have, and I know there's a lot of lower-income folks that watch my channel that think that I've got it made in the shade. I even had one guy comment the other day that, oh yeah, this is easy when you got a guy with a pension and a retirement. I don't have any pension or retirement. I had some money saved up when I first moved down here, but in my attempt to try to get this business started a little too early, I blew through a lot of that. Now, I just got what I make every month, whether it's what I do here on the channel or what I do in my full-time job. But it's simply by the grace of God that I get through each month. I keep thinking that I'm going to check my bank account tomorrow and it's going to be down in the toilet like it always used to be. But it is literally by the grace of God that I'm able to pay my bills each month and still have something left over. I don't know how it works, But all I can say is I've made prioritizing my health by eating the right foods a major factor. I've had to make sacrifices to do that, and it has been worth those sacrifices. It'll be worth it for you to make the sacrifices to eat the right food, just like it'll be worth it for you to make the right choices when you make decisions on your daily job, whether you make decisions when you're voting. It'll be worth it if you're sticking to good principles and integrity, when you're sticking to being honest, speaking the truth, not telling lies to yourself or to others. As far as the book goes, I would say that it's worth a read because he goes into a lot of the scientific ways that they make this ultra-processed food and how it affects us. So it would be good for anybody to read. If you want to check it out, there's a link in the description for my Amazon Associates account. You can also look up the author, Chris Van Tulleken, on YouTube. He has a lot of videos out there. He sticks to the nutritional side of it, and that's what I try to do. But at the same time, I realize that if we have more and more people trying to restrict our freedom and trying to restrict our ability to eat natural, good, healthy food, that we do have to fight back against that. So that's why you're going to see some political discussion from me occasionally, but I am trying to keep this mostly about the health. It's just that there's a lot of bad actors out there who don't want to see us healthy, and they're in positions of power, and we're going to have to say no to them if we want to get healthy. Anyway, that's all I got for this one, guys. I hope you found it useful. I hope you find the book interesting, and I'll see you guys next time.
If we pay extra, could we maybe get some grease or fat?